Hello and welcome to Under the Superscope, where we take a look at some of the most famous games of all time and try to work out if they still hold up today. And this week's an interesting one, as the game we're looking at to some didn't hold up when it first came out, including our very own review, where we saw Kid Icarus Uprising as merely average. But of course that's one person's opinion, and every game is subjective to the likes and dislikes of the individual. Some call Uprising one of the highest grades in the industry, and others simply don't like it. In fact, for this episode, I conducted a few Twitter polls to try and wager consensus on a few key categories, and the results really speak for themselves. While most leaned to be positive, almost every single question had a significant split. I asked what people thought of the controls, whether they felt there's a difference in quality between flight and land battles, whether they can follow the story during gameplay, and whether visuals or controls are the more important factor to them in the case of a remaster. We'll use the results to inform and refine our analysis, but just like anyone else, this is my opinion. Andre may not be too fond of Uprising, but I am, and though I'm going to attempt to reason my opinions by taking apart the game design, Andre could do the very same thing with a different conclusion. So without further ado, let's work out what makes Kid Icarus Uprising so good. Maybe this is a different episode, but I don't like the original Kid Icarus. I find it too slippery, too demanding, and frankly, a little boring. Myths and Monsters likewise isn't among my favourite games. And then, silence. From 1991 until 2006, Pit would not grace the world again outside of an ugly trophy in Melee. But in 2006 came the announcement of Super Smash Bros. Brawl, and right there in the reveal trailer was a totally redesigned Pit. Pit's appearance in Brawl saw quite a staggering alteration compared to other characters. Not only did he look completely different, but he was given a voice, a more direct role with Palutena, and his moves didn't even really feel like the NES character. With his appearance in Brawl, Sakurai rebooted Kid Icarus and saw the franchise in an entirely new light. By all means and purposes, Brawl's Pit might have been more famous than the Kid Icarus franchise. And Sakurai wasn't done. In 2010, the late Satoru Iwata gave us our first look at Nintendo 3DS, and it was time to see a game. Our first 3DS game, and the return of a long-dormant franchise entirely reimagined. From the word go, it was clear Uprising wasn't a simple sequel to the original games. This was a high-action, off-the-wall shooter, and while shooting was a pillar of the NES original, it was nothing like this, and the whole platforming basis was completely removed. Characters and enemies may be familiar, but that's just about all there is to tie these games together. With Uprising, Nintendo went out to make a AAA handheld game, with production values worthy of Sakurai's lead. This is the guy who makes Super Smash Bros. After all, and while we can argue whether the gameplay works, there is no denying how insanely beautiful Uprising is. And a lot of this beauty barely stays on screen for more than a few seconds. The scale and scope of these worlds is truly immense, and as are the monsters who inhabit them. Debuting the 3DS with a sequel to what I consider an average NES game may not be the most exciting idea on paper, but Sakurai made it work. This is his Pit, his Kid Icarus, and his take on the IP. You can feel that Sakurai didn't know when Kid Icarus was going to get another shot, and he truly poured everything he could into Uprising. There's so much content and so much wonder, and it even feels like there's multiple sequels jammed into one game. The production is unarguably staggering. But yeah, it came with a stand. The mark of a good control scheme isn't one with tons of inputs or complex actions. Limitations are often the key, and then you find ways to add complexity to your simplicity. Like in Breath of the Wild, your sword is always on Y and your bow is always on ZR. That's all you need to attack, and every single sword and bow works this way, but the game adds complexity with different properties provided by each individual weapon. It's simple and easy to understand. Mario just has you run and jump, but the complexity comes from level design and limited abilities provided by power-ups. Pokemon is so simple. You perform every move in the exact same way, but you have to learn elemental properties and there's a random chance of scoring a critical hit, which encourages you to take risks. They're doing different things with the same inputs, but from game to game, one element remains the same. They all use a standard controller. But sometimes there comes a game that tries something different, and that's what the Nintendo DS encouraged. The system could play games like a Game Boy with traditional button inputs, or you could play entirely with touch or turn the system on its side. Or, like with Metroid Prime Hunters, get creative and try a combination of two inputs. Prime Hunter's control scheme was something of a precursor to Kid Icarus Uprising, and while there are major differences, one should ask whether it even worked here. And I would say no. Hunters did prove that the DS could handle demanding titles with design elements of Metroid Prime, but its controls simply weren't very comfortable for me. It doesn't matter how fast and fluid they can be, if I'm not comfortable, I'm not having fun. So what about Uprising's stand? Does it fix the comfort issue? Well, while I think it softens the blow, it really highlights one of the main problems. Humans don't have 3 hands. Nintendo quite often forget this. It's very tricky to play Uprising and feel comfortable without some kind of support, whether that be a table edge, or your knee, or of course, the stand. Where it evolved from Prime Hunters though is the reduced level of strain. You don't need to hold the stylus up to the touchscreen's dead zones, but instead, well, Pit and Palutena will tell you.
Flick the stylus left or right to change direction quickly.
Huh. Like spinning a globe.
Yep, like a globe. It's uncommon for you to have the stylus flying all around the screen, as instead of holding it in an awkward position, you're encouraged to flick it around. More often than not, the stylus is right in the centre of the screen. Comfortable still isn't the word for it, but it does abide by the limitations of a simple control scheme that we just talked about. Circle pad is move, L is shoot, and touchscreen is turn. That's all you need to know to play Uprising. Of course it's more complex than that, with melee attacks triggering when you press shoot in front of an enemy. There's hundreds upon hundreds of different weapons. And there's the divide between flight and ground. Even though it's awkward in its nature, Uprising still shares the same accessible Nintendo design philosophies. When inquiring whether people enjoyed the controls, 54% replied agreeing they indeed did, while 9% said no and they ruined the game for them. The remaining 37% didn't like the controls but still enjoyed the game. And that's the interesting result. Earlier, my conclusion was, if I'm not comfortable, I'm not having fun. And yet I think I fall into the 37% camp. I don't love the controls, but I still love the game. The sense of excitement, the energetic story, and the clever timing of enemies keeps Uprising enthralling, but it goes against what I consider the pillar of a good game. Controls are detrimental to designing an enjoyable game, and even titles with less than perfect control schemes are built around those limitations of level designs. Uprising is a strange anomaly. Sure, enemies are certainly designed around long range and melee attacks, but the only handicap to the on-ground camera are the goddess powers. These are limited use abilities that can greatly damage enemies beyond your standard attacks. There's Auto Reticle that snaps your cursor onto an enemy, there's Explosion, which, of course, erupts an explosion, and dozens upon dozens of others. But are these enough? Well, in the game's multiplayer mode, where every player has the same limitations, I'd say, yeah, totally. But in the single player, with the length of some of these on-ground sections, I really don't think so. In multiplayer, they're constantly getting reset upon death, which naturally happens quite often, but you're given the thrill to stay alive, with goddess powers slowly running out as you do so. In the core campaign though, once they're gone until you die. The consensus I've found is more people enjoy the flying sections compared to the on-ground sections, and a great contributor to that is, I think, the simpler control scheme. When flying, the camera is fixed, so all you need to worry about is moving Pit and moving the reticle. It's still not the most comfortable control scheme, but it's certainly a step up. Uprising does do its best to teach the on-ground controls though. The very first level starts you framed directly at a wall. This encourages you to experiment with the free camera and move it around. For reference, every single other level frames you in the direction you need to go. So of course, the results were mixed again with this question. 43% of people equally enjoyed both flight and on ground, while 37% preferred flight over land. And that leaves the remaining 20% actually preferring land battle. I think I've made my stance fairly clear with preferring flight, but why is that exactly? Well, flight in Uprising is like a thrilling rollercoaster ride. Not only are the visuals utterly outstanding, but the camera director knew exactly how to frame each and every scene. This automatic camera enables some stunning results. A constant theme of flying is escalation. Let's take Chapter 4 for instance. Most levels begin by easing you in with simple enemy patterns, and then they introduce a unique twist, and continue to grow and grow them. And that's very true here in Chapter 4. We set the scene with stormy clouds and story setups provided by Pit and Palutena, until...
Reaper eyes?
This is really bad!
Yep, things are about to get crazy. We're introduced to Reapers from the original Kid Icarus, only now there's an entire army of them. They're just background imagery for now, so they're no obvious threat. But then we begin to slowly see them one by one as we attempt to flee them in a nearby canyon. Then we exit the canyon, and hundreds of them start firing giant lasers at us, and we have to avoid each and every one as the music ramps up and Pit shrieks in fear. And that's just one example of escalation. So, what happens after that? Well, things suddenly slow down and escalation is not just reset, but it's toned down significantly. On land, instead of hundreds of Reapers, we now slowly sneak past one, and then two, and then more. The foot sections are much slower than the rides or the flight sections. In the air, enemies take no more than just a few hits, whereas on land, you'll be there for quite a while pummeling the exact same enemy. The balancing makes sense as they're on screen for less time in the air, but it makes Pit feel significantly weaker when on the ground. In the air you're dodging an army of Reapers, whereas on land you take on a small handful. It's jarring and inherently less thrilling, and that, mixed with having to deal with a free camera, makes the on-foot sections feel not just less friendly, but also less inviting. So why do 20% of people actually prefer them? Well, there is a lot to like about the freedom offered by on-foot design. Each level has multiple optional paths that dynamically shift with new story conversations, and there's a lot of skill involved with the slower but more intimate combat. Land battle is way more dynamic with plenty of different opportunities to diverge from the critical path, and many levels even have gates that can only be accessed when playing on a higher difficulty, usually offering new weapons or shortcuts. The drawback here though is every time you die, you're forced to go down a notch in difficulty. It may encourage careful play, but it's super frustrating to have to restart a level, including going through the flying section again if you want to stay at static difficulty. There are so many subjectively good elements in Uprising, but this one I simply can't get behind. No matter whether you're in the air or on the ground, Uprising's core skeleton remains the same. Sure, you can move the camera on the ground, but you're still moving and shooting with the same weapons against the same enemies, and those enemies are actually pretty clever. You'll find they're introduced one by one in small, easy to manage environments, and every single one is distinct in shape and colour. Older shooters use this design method all the time to let you know exactly how to deal with upcoming enemies. Doom's brown demons have slow-moving projectiles where the humans are weaker but shoot more rapidly. Halo has different coloured grunts, and the elites are much larger with a very different shape. Even the most powerful red grunts look nothing like red elites. I'm sure I'll whine about Halo 4 a lot more in the future, but part of the reason this game was such a drop in quality is because the differentiating colours and shapes don't seem to be anything of importance to the developers. In the midst of all the action, do you know what colour this grunt is? Because he just looks grey to me. Uprising, just like Doom, just like Halo, just like Half-Life, just like Resident Evil 4, has very distinct enemies and encourages you to learn their attributes within close experience with each one. Then it's comfortable to mix them all together and trust you know how to handle all of them. Some are weak, some are strong, some only take damage from melee attacks, and some you just need to avoid. They're all given context, clear vulnerabilities, and memorable designs just like the shooters of old. A lot of modern shooters lean towards realism rather than highlighting colours and shapes, and this can work for a certain vibe, but for pure arcade action, being able to take down a complex enemy while also handling a swarm of other, far different enemies can really only be done this way, otherwise it just feels cheap and unfair. There's a chapter quite late in the game that tests your understanding of enemy types. Every enemy you've seen up until now is replaced with a bland grey counterpart. Yet, even without colour, just the distinct shape is enough to give you the information you need. In so many ways, Icarus Uprising is up there with some of the greatest shooters. The flight sections are as good as Star Fox and Sin and Punishment, and the land sections, though fiddly with the controls, share many similarities with games like Halo and Doom. But of course, Uprising has its own flavour. Let's talk about its approach to storytelling, and why it's unique, and whether it even works. A traditional game is split up like this. A cutscene sets up a gameplay scenario, the player moves through it, the player triggers another cutscene, and then the player moves through it again. So many games are built on this groundwork, and it's a great motivator. You play to see more story, you watch more story to play. But it's very hard to make story and gameplay coexist at the same time. Some games do it through environmental storytelling, like Doom, which is actually pretty great at it, but a common trick is a radio. This is something that, again, Doom will do, Halo will do, Sunset Overdrive will do, Batman will do, Grand Theft Auto will do... Okay, alright, a lot of games do it. The difference here though, that radio is the prominent form of storytelling. These guys are always talking, all the time, it never ends. Usually chatter in your head or chatter on the radio is kept brief, as most players aren't able to give it their full attention. Cortana in Halo will only speak a few sentences for instance. So while most games look like this, Kid Icarus is a bit simpler, but also more complex. It looks like this. It's almost all gameplay, but it's also almost all story, and that's a huge pillar for what I think makes this game so enjoyable. There's no split between story and gameplay, it's all happening simultaneously, and so the story isn't setting up one bigger gameplay scenario, they're both always setting up and complementing each other. The Reaper example from earlier is even more impactful when Pierce and Palutena are constantly going back and forth on how big of a threat the Reapers truly are. In fact, these flight sections are all one big setup. They set the tone of a level and introduce new enemy types in quick succession, but they also set up exactly what's going on. They introduce characters, they keep Pit informed on what he's doing, and everything on screen is mirrored by the tremendous script. Story often changes in development, but I wonder how much leeway Kid Icarus even had in that regard, as if you change a line of the script, you're also going to have to adjust the gameplay accordingly. The The on-ground sections lose a bit of that back and forth, and with more freedom, there's also more room for dead air. You'll trigger new conversations when finding alternate paths, but you can sit there for a while without hearing a word of dialogue. And that is a little strange when the flight sections practically have them non-stop. But does it work? Is it actually effective? Well, to Twitter. 72% of people had no problem following the story amongst all the chaos of enemy patterns, bullets flying everywhere, and a beautiful, booming musical score. Understandably, not everyone could though. 22% couldn't always keep up, and 6% struggled to keep up entirely. That's where the problem lies. Almost 30% of those asked would have found themselves lost to what was going on at some point in the game. This wouldn't be the case if Kid Icarus leaned to the traditional style of storytelling, but would the gameplay still be enjoyable for the 72% who could follow the story? It's a tricky balance, but I think Sakurai and team made the right call. It can be absolutely thrilling to not only listen to the story, but see the consequences of it unfold before your eyes during actual gameplay. I for one find this take on narrative ingenious, and I find it miraculous that I could follow everything with so much going on. I don't think Pandora's Labyrinth of Deceit or that chapter where Pit becomes a ring would be anywhere close to the quality they were if it weren't for the story happening one-to-one with the action. And what a story it is! If you haven't played the game, then you might want to skip to 1709 as we're going to discuss a spoiler, but I'll keep the plot itself fairly under wraps. So as a sequel, Uprising initially feels kinda safe. It hits the same story beats as the original, with Medusa and several bosses from the original game being resurrected. You fight your way through, regain the 3 sacred treasures, and take on Medusa again. Of course, there's some originality thrown in along the way, and characters are far more engaging than they've ever been, but Uprising's first third is about what you would expect. But then there's the fake out. After defeating Medusa in what appropriately feels like the final boss, the credits roll, and, or should I say hand, Hades. Uprising isn't over, in fact it's barely begun. From here, so many new characters enter the scene with so many new scenarios. New enemies like the forces of nature introduced, and 3 chapters revolve entirely around an alien invasion. There's new gods, new worlds, new everything. Uprising's not just a sequel, it feels like 3 of them. As I said, it's like the team didn't know when they would get another shot with this franchise and just threw in everything they could. Pit goes through so much, and though it's often kept lighthearted, there are some truly hard-hitting moments. Story is without a doubt a highlight of Uprising, and they managed to turn one of its biggest strengths into a constant gameplay enabler. The detail is truly immense too. There's 2 or 3 chapters where Palutena is out of action, and so Veridi takes control of your flight patterns, and for those few chapters, the entire menu UI is completely redesigned in the style of nature. They could have easily kept the normal UI without anyone taking issue with it, but it's the kind of detail that takes Uprising to another level. Who knows when Pit will fly again? It's almost refreshing for an industry so dependent on sequels to clearly not even think about what's next. There aren't any loose ends, there aren't any areas I feel didn't get their due. Uprising is just a complete package. The campaign is far longer than most other shooters with so many reasons to revisit it. The weapon system feels never ending, and this adds so much variety and possibility to the combat system. And the online multiplayer is not only still active, but it feels excellently balanced with tremendous map design and level dominance. So, do the controls ruin this? Are they actually a problem? Well, here's our final question. If the game were to receive a remaster, which change would interest you most? Now I admit, I certainly had a motive with this question. Of course, both features would inherently need to change if Uprising got a port to the Switch. 240p visuals and touch controls just wouldn't work. The reason I asked this was to see how attached people were to the current control scheme, and the results looked like this. 44% of people would prefer updated visuals, and 56% would prefer updated controls. Kind of a shocking split if I'm honest. I expected a way higher number on changing the controls, and this made me question my own conclusion. Can Uprising actually work without this control scheme? Is it detrimental to the experience? And well, our very own Ash pulls him to the rescue. Being left-handed is a problem in Uprising, as if you want to hold the stylus in your left hand, you'd have to use the Circle Pad Pro. But Ash didn't do that. What he did was play the game in its entirety with the face buttons. And how does Ash feel about the game, having played it without even using touch? Well, he still seems to love the game. Uprising is a strange game, and I don't blame anyone who can't get past the controls. But if you do stick with them, and tolerate them, you're rewarded with one of the most bombastic, elegant, and intelligent games to hit the industry. I think Uprising has a future with an entirely different control scheme, and if that comes to pass, we could be looking at a clear classic. I fully agree with our original review. Andre makes completely valid points, but my conclusion remains the same. Uprising is a damaged gem, a flawed masterpiece. It has all the right ideas, and mostly has the right execution. It just fails to be comfortable. That would be the undoing of a lesser game, but Uprising holds its own. There's certainly room for improvement, but the base game is so good. And that's all for this week. What do you guys think of Icarus Uprising? And what's your conclusion on the controls? Let us know in the comments below, and of course be sure to subscribe to GameXplain for a lot more from under the Super Scope and other things gaming too. Until next time, bye!